to the Fit and Fabulous podcast with Dr. Jaime Seaman. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jaime. Welcome back to the Fit and Fabulous podcast. Thank you everybody who's listened to our previous episodes, left us reviews and downloads. We so much appreciate that. Sharing with your friends, and for all our YouTube people watching on video, thanks for subscribing to this channel and leaving us your questions and comments. We always appreciate the love and support. Well, I have an amazing guest, Dr. Mary Newport, on today on the Fit and Fabulous podcast, and I have been wanting to talk with her for a long time now because I met Dr. Newport a number of years ago, kind of in the exogenous ketone space is when I first heard about her and her story and her husband's story, and we're going to talk about all of that. But she grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. She went to Xavier University for all her pre-medical training, graduated from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine in 1978. She trained in pediatrics at Children's Hospital Medical Center in Cincinnati. She completed her fellowship in neonatology, the care of sick and premature newborns, at the Medical University Hospital in Charleston, South Carolina. She practiced in the NICU in Florida for 30 years and served as a founding medical director for 2 NICU units in the Tampa Bay area. After taking some time off to take care of her husband, Steve, she resumed her medical practice at the opposite end of the spectrum and now makes home visits with people with chronic conditions. Dr. Newport was married to her husband, Steve, in 1972. They've got 2 daughters and a grandson. And Steve lost his battle with Alzheimer's and Lewy body dementia in 2016, and we're going to talk about that. But to carry on his legacy, she is a huge advocate in the ketogenic space, using alternative fuels for the brain for Alzheimer's patients and other disorders. She's authored a few different books. She speaks internationally on the subject of ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain. That's how I got introduced to her. And she is also a board certified ketogenic nutrition specialist, which I finished my certification, I don't think very long after you, Dr. Newport. So this is a new thing in the space. And it was super exciting to see it come around because low carb and ketogenic, I was just recording another podcast with a few other doctors, and we were talking about, 5 or 6 years ago, people thought we were crazy for talking about a diet like this. So
Dr. Newport, imagine 13 years ago how crazy people thought I was.
Yeah, you're a pioneer. So I read your bio, but tell people who you are, Dr. Newport, and I'd love to talk about your husband's story.
Oh yeah. So my background is neonatology, care of sick and premature newborns. And then my husband developed Alzheimer's when he was only 51 years old. Are you ready for the story yet?
Yeah. Tell us everything.
Yeah. So, basically we were married for 10 years before we decided to have our children. He was really nervous about my job and the emergencies and getting called out all times of the day and night, and how that would be for our children, especially if he was working full time. So he came to me one day and said, how about if I stay home and take care of our kids and work from home, which was very unusual, especially for a man in those days.
Yeah.
But it worked perfectly for our practice because he could do accounting and manage my practice from home since I was a hospital-based physician. So he was always there for them. And that really worked out perfectly for us. And basically, and when he was 51, he started having problems, and he was a perfectionist accountant. I mean, if he was missing a penny, he'd look for it for 2 or 3 days. But he started having problems with remembering to take our daughters to appointments, even if I called him 30 minutes ahead of time to remind him. And he would have these, he would put Post-its in the doorway hanging from a long piece of tape that he'd have to walk by to try to remind him of things. It was really kind of an interesting strategy on his part. But, I don't know, we both kind of thought it was like midlife crisis or, something strange, going on like that. But then it got more serious because he couldn't remember if he'd been to the bank and the post office, and he would start procrastinating on getting just real simple things like a quarterly tax report that should have taken 20 minutes. It was all on computer, it would take days for him to get it done. And he'd miss deadlines and like, what is going on? So we saw a neuropsychiatrist at the time, and Steve was depressed at that point. And the memory issues were blamed on depression, although the word dementia actually came up at that point. But then, things continued to get worse. And he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's when he was only 54 years old. And that was a shock because, we thought we were going to grow old together. There was longevity in both of our families. And suddenly, with the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, the average lifespan is about 7 years from that point. So it looked like we weren't even going to get close to retiring together. And so it was very heartbreaking. And our daughters were teenagers. It was very, very hard on them. When he was diagnosed, we finally understood why all these strange things were happening. But, it just kind of took our life in a completely different path. So, he, around 2006, I got very interested in nutrition. And up to that point, well, you probably know as a physician, I mean, how many hours of nutrition training did you get in medical school?
Yeah, not much, but I did my undergraduate training in nutrition, which is different than, a lot of my colleagues. So I had a lot more, but yeah, I mean, a handful of lectures, if that.
I had like one lecture. It was a 3-hour lecture one afternoon on nutrition. So, I thought eating a low fat diet, reduce fat snacks and things like that were like the way to go, skim milk and all of that. And my weight just went up and up and up, fighting it all the time. And, Steve's Alzheimer's, kept getting worse. And then I read about a study, it was in 2006, about people with Alzheimer's, and they looked at their diet, and they were looking at specifically at Mediterranean diet. And they ranked people according to whether they had like the most Mediterranean diet versus the least. And there was like a 4 years longer, lifespan for the people that ate the most Mediterranean-like diet compared to the people that ate the least diet. And that was really the first time it even occurred to me that nutrition could have anything to do with Alzheimer's. I mean, they still say they don't understand what causes it. And I think there are actually a lot of causes that end up with the same pathology in the brain, but diet is a really big factor. And so we completely redid our diet. And I just read and about the Mediterranean, all kinds of diets, but settled on Mediterranean. And we kind of chucked all of the convenience food, fast food, all of that for whole foods, whole grains when we had grains, much more fat, and most, olive oil and butter mostly, not coconut oil yet at that point. And I benefited greatly from it. I lost about 94 pounds over 3 years.
Wow.
And that was diet plus exercise. Steve kept getting worse, and I have no way of knowing if it slowed it down or not. It just wasn't possible to tell with one person. But then in 2008, he was going downhill, and there were 2 clinical trials that came along. There hadn't been any for a while. And I had them scheduled 2 days in a row. And it was 2 different drugs for Alzheimer's. And we were so hopeful. We thought, oh, finally, maybe these are one of the cure, the cure that they've been talking about. And so I got on the internet the night before the first screening, and I was looking for the risks and benefits of the 2 drugs. And I happened on a press release about a medical food that was going to be out in about a year. And they had done some clinical trials, and their pilot study, they had almost half of the people had improved memory and cognition after just 1 dose of this medical food. And, they didn't say what it was. They mentioned ketones, but I found their patent application. And I read all about the problem of insulin resistance and insulin deficiency in the brain of Alzheimer's. This was the first time I had ever heard anything about this. And that ketones could potentially bypass that problem by providing an alternative fuel to the brain. Because, with insulin resistance, what it boils down to is that glucose doesn't get normally into the cells in the brain in these areas that are affected by Alzheimer's. And insulin is very, very complicated. It has so many effects. in the brain, more than just glucose getting into cells. It's involved in almost every Alzheimer pathology. I've been learning more and more about that one way or the other. So at that point, what they had come up with for the medical food was using MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil. And this oil, when you consume it, your liver converts part of it to ketones. And the rest is basically released into the bloodstream, and it's used immediately as fuel. It's used in the muscles, heart, even in the brain, we now know. And so it's a neat trick. It was a really neat idea that you could provide ketones and possibly bypass insulin resistance in Alzheimer's. And almost half, it was like 20 people in their pilot study. They gave them 40 mLs of MCT oil, which is almost 3 tablespoons. And I bet they were all in the bathroom the rest
I was going to say, that's quite a bit.
But they, 9 out of 20 had improved scores. And they had 2 days. One day they got placebo, another day they got MCT oil. The people giving it didn't know which they got, much less the people getting it. So that was pretty impressive. And then they did a follow-up study, which was a 6-month study. Actually, many people were 90 days, and then others went on for 6 months. And it was 152 people, and they got very similar results, where nearly half of them had improvement in their mini mental status test and in their other cognitive testing. And this is really the first time I had ever heard about any treatment for Alzheimer's that improved memory and cognition. So, I thought, okay, we got to do something about this. And the patent application mentioned it was extracted from coconut oil. And the reason I even knew what MCT oil was is because I'm a neonatologist. We used to add it to the feedings of our tiniest preemies back in the 70s and early 80s. These were babies that were under 2 pounds, and they would grow faster. They would get home faster if we gave them MCT oil. And then it started, formula manufacturers started creating premature infant formulas, and they included MCT oil in it, which was very interesting. And one of the reasons they did that is because medium chain triglycerides, MCTs, are in human breast milk. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to mimic it. And so almost every formula now, if you look at it, and I've been really at many places around the world, I go into groceries, I look at the, the labels on the infant formulas, they add coconut oil to almost every infant formula. And when it's not coconut oil, it's palm kernel oil, which is very close to coconut oil in its composition. Both have medium chain triglycerides, and some have MCT oil also, like babies that don't absorb fats well, and these tiniest preemies. So, it was just kind of luck, that I had the background where I knew what MCT oil was. I didn't know we could get it on the shelf. I didn't know it was out there. So basically I'm finding this out. It's about 1 a.m. by the time I'm done reading this, and he had a screening first thing in the morning. So we go for it, couldn't do anything about what I had just learned. And he did really very poor. He needed to score 18 out of 30 points on this mini mental status test, and he only scored 14 points. And the doctor had him draw a clock, and it was a few little circles. It wasn't a big circle. It was a few circles, and it had 9, 10, 11, 12 kind of in a vertical line. It was very disorganized. And the doctor told me he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. And when I look at the stages of Alzheimer's, he was between stage 5 and 6 out of 7 stages. So quite advanced. But on the way home, I thought, what do we got to lose? I'm going to pick up some coconut oil. So we stopped at a health food store. As a doctor, we were told it was the artery clogging fat. I don't know about you, but we were told it was really bad fat, but there it is in health food stores.
Like
and I thought,
margarine.
Yeah. And I thought, well, his brain's dying, let's do something. And when we got home, I got on the internet and I reminded myself, what are the medium chain triglycerides? And I was able to find the fatty acid composition of coconut oil. And I figured out that it was 60% medium chain triglycerides. So I calculated an amount of coconut oil that would be equal to the dose of the medical food that they had given to people in that longer study. And so the next day he was scheduled for another screening. Luckily, it was at 1 in the afternoon instead of bright and early. So I mixed, it was 7 teaspoons of coconut oil into oatmeal. And I took some myself, and I have no gallbladder, and I got like big time indigestion, from it. But we got to the screening, and they tested him, and his score went up from 14 to 18 out of 30, and he qualified for the study.
Wow.
So it was like, okay, was this really the coconut oil, or, good luck, prayers, whatever, But so I thought, well, we're going to keep it going, because scientifically it made sense to me that ketones could provide an alternative fuel to the brain. And so basically from that point on, every morning he got that amount for breakfast. But then I started cooking with it, adding it to other meals. I thought, if the brain, it peaked at, they said the MCTs peaked at 90 minutes. So what happens the rest of the day? The levels were back down to baseline after 3 hours. So what about the other 21 hours? So I thought, if the brain needs ketones for 3 hours, it could use them for 24 hours. So I started basically giving it to them, at each meal, and everything became coconut in our house, coconut milk, grated coconut, everything. I had so many books about coconut. And then I started talking to Dr. Richard Beach at the NIH, and he was the ketone expert in the world, and I got his number from, I think, Wikipedia. He was at the NIH in Washington, DC, called the number, he answers the phone himself. I was just floored, but I basically asked him, I said, so, I've been reading this thing about insulin resistance and ketones, and do you think it's possible that coconut oil could help somebody with Alzheimer's? And he goes, no, the levels would never be high enough. And he said, yeah, there's these people with the medical food. They called me about 5 years ago. And I said, no, the levels from MCT oil would never be high enough to help anybody. And I'm like, well, at this point, every day we were seeing improvements with Steve. And he said it was like a light bulb came on in his head. He knew he had Alzheimer's. He was very aware. And he would come bouncing down the hall now. Instead of shuffling, he could find utensils. He could figure out how to get water out of the refrigerator, things like that. Whistling again, sense of humor coming back. I mean, big difference in how he felt. And, we had already, felt like something had changed dramatically over like just 4 or 5 days. So 2 weeks after he started the coconut oil, Steve drew another clock, and this time it was a whole circle. It had all the numbers around it. It was really messy. He had a whole bunch of hands of the clock. I don't know, like a couple dozen of them or so, but it was more organized. And I faxed it to Dr. Beach, and he called me and he says, well, this is unexpected. So then he started sending me articles that he had written, hypothesis papers. He had 3 of the other people that had collaborated with him on these papers call me, Dr. George Cahill, who had discovered that that ketones increase during starvation, that ketones provide up to 2/3 of the fuel to the brain during starvation. He called me, Dr. Theodore Van Italy and Dr. Sammy Hashem, who had figured out that MCT oil converted to ketones in the liver back in the 1960s. They both called me. So I had some just extraordinary experiences, just because of that thing that happened, just by accident on the internet. And Steve continued to improve. I started actually, when I found out I could get MCT oil, I started mixing MCT and coconut oil. I thought, well, maybe there's something in coconut oil that's not in MCT oil that might be helping them. And it probably is the case. But he improved. I mean, he had not been able to, he walked very weird. He was slow, and he would kind of pick up his feet very weird, and he couldn't run anymore. But 2 months after we started this, his gait was normal again, and he was able to run again. He had tremors that went away. He had a problem with reading that he told me later. I mean, 3 or 4 months after he announced one day he could read. And I said, well, why couldn't you read? And he said, because the words were shaking on the page, and now it has stopped shaking. So he had some kind of a visual problem going on, probably in the occipital lobe, not in his eyes, but he could read again. And then at 9 or 10 months, he could remember what he read like several hours earlier. He would tell me about things he had read. And he got well enough that he was able to start volunteering at the hospital where I worked. He was in the supply warehouse. He would put stickers on supplies, and he would help deliver supplies to the units, and that just was so great for him, because he was so distressed that he couldn't work.
Purpose back, yeah.
Right. And so then 2 years into this whole thing, Dr. Veach asked him to be a pilot study of one person with the ketone ester that he had been developing at the NIH for about 20 years, and that was extraordinary for us. I knew about the ester. By this time, I had actually, I was working on a book. I was trying to get awareness out of this idea of ketones as an alternative fuel, and that this ketone ester could be a key, to help prevent it and treat people that had Alzheimer's, at the levels much higher, much higher than you could get with MCT oil or coconut oil. So I was already writing this, and then they had finished toxicity testing, and Dr. Veach said, how about if Steve is a one-person pilot, clinical trial? And since I was a physician, he felt very comfortable with that, that if there were problems, I would pick up on it and be able to do something about it. So Steve became, and it at that point, it's a kind of a long story, but he did get in the clinical trial. And he was, we found out later he was on a placebo for the first 12 to 14 months. So we could not attribute any of that improvement to a drug. It was all ketones, coconut oil, MCT oil at that point. But then he was in a crossover study. So he switched over to the drug. And he was on it for 5 to 7 months, we think. And we could tell he was on it because his hair started growing out like gold color, like a light gold color, which was a known side effect of the drug. And, but he started doing some really strange things, started having setbacks. He had wounds that wouldn't heal. He'd nick himself shaving. It would bleed for 2 or 3 days. He fainted, which he'd never done in his life. And his CPK, enzymes went sky high. So I pulled him out of the study. I mean, being a doctor, they would tell me, well, the people that we think are on it, they're much worse than they were a year ago. So I, decided to pull him out of the study. And then we found out that this drug accelerated Alzheimer's.
Oh gosh.
Instead of treating it, it accelerated it. So he had a setback related to that. But Dr. Veach sent us the ester, and he started taking it, and several of the problems he was having completely reversed in like 24 hours. He was having to be talked through taking a shower. Okay, first put the soap in the shampoo in your hair. Okay, rub it in. Okay, now rinse it. Now do this. Now do this. Now do this. He could automatically do all of that again. He could pick clothes out, put them on instead of putting things on upside down and backwards, and then other problems we were seeing all kind of reversed in about 6 weeks. It was really pretty incredible. And he was stable for another 20 months, before he had another setback. And it's an unusually long time for somebody with Alzheimer's not to decline, So eventually, unfortunately, Steve began having seizures. And the first time he had one, I had somebody staying with him at that point, and I had just left. He hugged and kissed me goodbye, told me he loved me, go to the hospital. 5 minutes later, I get a call from, our caregiver, and she said that Steve had a severe seizure, and he was still having a seizure, and she had called EMS, and he was blue. He had stopped breathing. And luckily I was 5 minutes away, and I got home. I got there before EMS did. And he had fallen back. He was standing up, and he fell straight back, hit his head, and the seizure was 20 minutes long. And he had another one on the way to the hospital, and he was never the same after that. So that was really the, I kept going with the ketones and everything else, very healthy diet. but he lived about 2.5 years after that. And we kept him at home. I hired people to help take care of him. And he did pass away from Alzheimer's disease. And we found out he donated his brain, and we found out he also had Lewy body dementia, which I kind of suspected from the weird gait and the tremors and things like that he had. But it was good. It was good closure to know exactly what he had, how advanced it was. But I did feel like we got almost 4 better years, because of this intervention with ketones, this whole thing with coconut MCT oil and then the ketone ester really bought us extra time, and it was better quality time than before, he started taking the coconut oil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what year was that he did the ketone esters with Dr. Veach?
So, so the coconut oil was 2008 and the ketone ester was 2010. So it was about 2 years later.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it was interesting because we had just gotten back. We took a trip to Greece, which was quite an adventure. It was the first time I got to talk internationally about ketones. And the man who had invented the medical food, he was there too. I got to talk to him quite a lot. He gave a presentation. I gave a presentation at Alzheimer's Disease International. So it was the first time, and Steve and our younger daughter came along. It was quite a trip. We got to go up on the Parthenon in Athens, and it was really amazing. But and then not long after we got back is when Steve started with the ketone ester.
What did the can you tell people what is a ketone ester and ketone salts?
Basically, up until those were available, the only way you could really get into ketosis was by burning your own fat. So if you fast, like overnight fasting is very popular now, 12, 14, 16 hours, you don't eat, like say overnight, you will start to break down, you will use up the stores of glucose that are in your liver, and you will start to break down fat, and you'll go into a little bit of ketosis. So your ketone levels will become elevated. So if you do a prolonged fast, you pretty much deplete the stores of glucose in your body over 36, 48 hours. And then your ketone levels will get higher and higher and higher, and they get quite high, especially beta hydroxybutyrate. Around 10 days, they get very, very high, and then it kind of levels off. And at that point, ketones are supplying at least 60% of the fuel to the brain. And so basically, that was the main way that you could get ketones that elevated. MCT oil does take it up regardless of what you eat. You can get some increase from that. So around 2016, ketone salts came out as something, and this is beta hydroxybutyrate, the same beta hydroxybutyrate you make in your body from fat, that was actually in a supplement. So this was a huge step forward as far as possibly being able to, treat a condition that, had something to do with insulin resistance or poor glucose uptake. And then it also, like a lot of people found that it was very helpful with weight loss too, because you turn more to burning fat because you're using fat as your primary fuel. It tends to help preserve muscle more than if you're eating a very high carb, low fat diet. It's also ketones suppress your appetite, which is very interesting. If you're on a high carb, low fat diet, you're hungry all the time. I've been on many of those, and
Same.
you're just hungry. You just thinking about your next meal right after your previous meal. So just a lot of advantages. And so, Dominic D'Agostino at USF, we lived within 45 minutes of each other. And it was right around early 2009, I would say, he had just kind of gone to USF within the previous year, and he was studying a ketogenic diet for Navy SEALs who can have a seizure if they're underwater for 10 or 15 minutes, breathing 100% oxygen. And he was very interested in the ketogenic diet. And then there was an article in our Tampa Bay Times local newspaper about what happened with Steve. And they interviewed Dr. Beach and some of the other people in ketone research. And he mentioned the ketone ester. And Dominic was like, what? There's a ketone ester that could possibly,
Yeah.
make things easier than like a super strict ketogenic diet, for these Navy SEALs. And so Steve and I went to a research update at University of South Florida, and Dominic recognized us from the article, introduced himself, and we basically became fast friends. He introduced me to people at the Alzheimer Institute there about possibly doing studies, but he began to really explore everything, all these different potential ways of increasing ketones, taking butanediol, taking various types of ketone esters, and then ketone salts. And ketone salts had been around a little bit. They had been used mainly in research, but one of the studies that Dr. Beach had sent to me was children that have it's a fatty acid enzyme deficiency that they can't oxidize fatty acids normally. And these children, I mean, as infants, they may start walking, they stop walking. Their heart gets very enlarged. They go into congestive heart failure. They die early. And there were these 3 cousins, little children that were treated with ketone salts, and it reversed their symptoms over 12 to 18 months. They got better and better and better. Well, the levels were not very high. They weren't ketone ester high. They were in the same ballpark as the MCT oil I was giving Steve, which was pretty incredible, but they were ketone salts. And so they existed before this, but nobody had done anything to market or do anything more with it, other than research. So Dominic really took the bull by the horns, and they studied this intensively. And then in early 2016, a product launched, Prove It, launched the first product. And it kind of, I would say, took off like a bullet.
Yeah.
It just grew exponentially. And the idea of using ketones, and I think that also probably stimulated the whole trend in ketogenic diet again. It's like resurfaced a few times, in the last maybe 30 40 years, but this time it took off again. And then the ketone ester became available in early 2018. And that one is much more expensive to produce. It's much more difficult to produce. So it hasn't gotten out there as wildly popular as the ketone salts, and not nearly as available, I would say.
And it's less palatable. I've tried, I've tried a few. So when you gave Steve ketone esters in 2010, what did it taste like?
It was horrible. It was just horrible. Yeah, Dr. Beach sent me the raw material, and he said, we don't know what to do with it exactly. You figure it out.
Gosh.
And it was like jet fuel and vodka or something. I mean,
Jet fuel and vodka.
so bad. And it was, undiluted what he sent. And they suggested, his chemist was making it for us, drop by drop. I mean, that was all they could make, was enough for one person clinical trial, very, very expensive to make it in the lab that way. And so I tried everything. They suggested diluting it like 3 to 1 with water, maybe trying different flavorings. And oh my gosh, I tried everything. And it was really bad. It was bad. And I ended up, and I hated doing this, I settled on soda stream concentrate, like cherry, orange, grape. It would make it at least somewhat drinkable. And Steve shuddered still every time he took it, and I hated that it was sugar. And I tried their diet and made it even worse. They were so bitter, like the diet forms of it. But the interesting thing was, I would check his ketone levels. We did some kind of dosing studies to figure out how much to give him. Dr. Veach really wanted to push his levels up to 4 to 5 millimoles.
Okay, I was about to ask what you were considering, therapeutic.
Yeah, so he was getting 25 grams of beta hydroxybutyrate 3 times a day.
Oh, wow. That's a
which is
lot.
a whole lot. It was a
Mhm.
lot. And it took us levels up. But I would measure his blood sugar too every time we checked it. And even with the sugar, his blood sugar didn't go up, it went down.
Right. So I think Dominic has reported on this that we see a glucose lowering effect with exogenous ketone use, and nobody can really explain why. I've definitely seen it monitoring my levels, but I think it's an interesting therapeutic application, for somebody that has diabetes or insulin resistance.
Insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome. And Dr. Beach thinks that somehow the ketones improve insulin sensitivity.
Mhm.
And Dr. Stephen Cunnane, I remember talking to him about it too. He's done a whole lot of work with ketone and glucose PET scan and Alzheimer's studies, mainly with MCT oil, but he's actually about to study ketone salts now. And he was able to show that ketone uptake is normal in the Alzheimer brain in the same areas that have decreased glucose uptake, which is a profound discovery. It's a good proof of concept. Okay, this idea has validity to it. And he's been able to show in studies that MCT oil does increase ketone, the percent of energy provided by ketones to the brain, and improves cognition. So some pretty good studies coming out of him. But with the ketone ester, I remember talking to him about this, in 2010, and he said, well, the brain, okay, ketones can provide maybe 60%, but you still 40% of the fuel of the brain is coming from glucose. So he didn't feel that there was a need to have to do like a super strict ketogenic diet that's extremely low carb, for Alzheimer's. He thinks, you could still provide glucose to feed that part of the brain that still will use glucose. And he also thought that possibly, the ketones helped somehow improve the glucose uptake as well. He thought there could be something like that going on. Still don't know exactly the answer to that.
Yeah. I
But
mean, they call it type 3 diabetes, right? I mean, Alzheimer's. So we know that.
diabetes of the brain, it's insulin deficiency, insulin resistance, and it starts in the areas that are first affected by Alzheimer's, and it gets worse and it progresses through the brain as the disease worsens. And it's I so I just finished the first draft of a new book that I'm writing, and I spent probably the first 10 months looking at Alzheimer's, all of the pathologies in the Alzheimer brain, cell by cell by cell, and you know um, the function, functional things that are happening. Like with Alzheimer's, we've heard for decades, plaques and tangles, and that's what all the research trying to get rid of these plaques. The drug that Steve took that made him worse was trying to get rid of the plaques, and it actually did get rid of tangles too. But he got worse, during that time, and why? So, it turns out there is a lot more going on, and even Dr. Alzheimer over 100 years ago said there were abnormal lipid deposits in the brain. He described those, and those were completely ignored till maybe 10 years ago. Now there's a couple groups that are researching what is going on with these abnormal lipid deposits, and it's it's basically almost every pathology in the brain has some connection to insulin resistance.
Mhm.
From what I've been reading, insulin resistance sometimes can trigger it, but the problem that causes, like, okay, so insulin resistance can increase inflammation in the brain, and inflammation is key to Alzheimer's. It's kind of the tipping point between people that have mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's, is that they develop this increase in inflammation in the brain. So insulin resistance increases inflammation in the brain. Well, inflammation also increases insulin resistance in the brain. So it's like a vicious cycle. And to me, it explains how it progresses, why it progresses. Inflammation gets worse, insulin resistance gets worse, fewer cells are getting glucose, and it just gradually, the person declines, sometimes not so gradually. Some people it happens fairly quickly over 2 or 3 years, but there are so many neurodegenerative diseases that follow a similar pattern. And the plaques and tangles. the insulin resistance seems to somehow contribute to formation of plaques and tangles. And the plaques themselves are toxic and they create more insulin resistance in the neurons and other cells. So it's just, all these little vicious cycles going on. It's really interesting. And there's some diet vitamin deficiencies involved too that are and have to do with making ATP, from fuel, which
it's an energy deficit problem. Yeah.
and it's one thing that I hadn't noticed before was that I found this in an article about this problem with energy that occurs in the Alzheimer brain is that you need ATP to make ATP. It's really interesting.
You need energy to make energy.
It has to do with breaking down glucose. When glucose comes in to a cell, it has to be converted to glucose 6-phosphate and then on down to pyruvate before it can be taken into mitochondria to make ATP. So it requires ATP to take that step from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. Yep. Yeah, so pretty interesting. So it's just kind of a vicious winding down of making ATP, in these cells. And, vitamins like niacin and thiamine are involved also in making ATP. And a lot of people are deficient in those. So it's a very complicated process what goes on, but insulin is like strongly involved in it, insulin deficiency. And so this is where, I think it's a combination of, providing that the ketogenic diet can help so much because there's a lot of evidence now that ketogenic diets are very helpful in reversing type 2 diabetes. There are studies by Jeff Volek, Michael Finney, Eric Westman, Sarah Hallberg, other people who are taking care of diabetics have had great success in getting them into remission with a ketogenic diet. And I mean, their numbers come way down. They get off insulin, they get off their other medications, many of them, or greatly reduce how much medication they're taking. And somebody, like with a hemoglobin A1C of 9 or 11, they'll come down to the normal range over a period of time. And their fasting blood sugar better, their fasting insulin gets better, they lose weight, they feel better. So it's like, why not type 3 diabetes? And there are a couple of case reports that were published of a man and a woman that they were obese, they had mild Alzheimer's, low mini mental status, but they also, the man had diabetes for 15 years. He was on insulin. The lady had metabolic syndrome with insulin resistance, and all on a 10-week ketogenic diet. They're all those numbers improved, related to diabetes, but their mini mental status score, the man went from 23 to 29 out of 30, and the woman went from 21 to 28 out of 30. And that's normal. Those are both considered normal scores. So they went from mild Alzheimer's to basically normal cognitive testing, which was, so, I hope to see more studies of that. But, the ketogenic diet addresses two parts of the problem. One is the insulin resistance, reversing it, and then providing ketones as fuel to the brain for those cells that are dealing with insulin resistance, in the brain. It's not something, that can completely correct overnight. For some people, it could take a year or 18 months to get everything back to normal. And then it's not like, okay, now I can go off the diet and eat what I used to eat before. It's really a lifestyle change, if people are determined, to do this and hopefully slow down brain aging and maybe prevent Alzheimer's or slow it down or delay it or improve, it's really a lifelong thing. It's not a temporary fix. And, I do think that exogenous ketones kind of play a role in there because it can boost ketone levels higher, for a period of time. And there's several people I've been following very closely for a number of years now that have been using a kind of a combination of a really healthy, like Mediterranean kind of diet or very low carb, higher fat diet, plus exogenous ketones. And they, ketone ester is like really expensive, but just bumping it up a little bit, nowhere near what Steve was getting. We're talking maybe 10 grams, once or twice a day. Just bumping it up a little bit seems to make some difference over maybe a week or two, a noticeable difference in what they remember, what they can talk about,
Mhm.
things like that. So I do feel that there's a role for those. But, I think just really getting a good healthy diet, low carb and higher fat, higher healthy fats, in the diet, a good. And, I think you probably know you can have a junk food keto diet.
Yeah. Yeah, you can still eat a lot of garbage. There's processed foods in all diets. Yeah. So do you feel like what's the best we have to offer right now for Alzheimer's? I mean, when we talk about these adjunctive things like ketogenic diet, MCT oil, exogenous ketones, do they all provide benefit? Where are we at with the best we have to offer?
Well, I think that, MCT oil, coconut oil, and exogenous ketones each kind of have a role. So I think of using coconut and MCT oil, kind of can help. I think using it with food as part of the diet, part of the fat that you're eating in the diet. First of all, it will get you into ketosis faster. It might allow you to be able to eat a little bit more carbohydrate, more maybe like in a Mediterranean diet. Whole grains are considered important. Legumes are considered important. Being able to work some of those foods that are considered important and maybe a little bit more fruit, as opposed to no fruit, something like that, like a dozen blueberries or something, by incorporating some MCT and coconut oil in there. And then I think then the exogenous ketones will boost your levels higher, and that could be beneficial in some way. And the levels usually last in the blood for several hours,
Mhm.
but one unknown is, are ketones kind of stored and used more slowly when they get to the brain, or how does that work? I don't think we know the answer to that just yet, but I do think it's worth doing for somebody that has Alzheimer's, experimenting with it and find out if it makes a difference or not.
Yeah.
I kind of tell people to give anything like this 3 months, to see if it makes any difference. That's in epilepsy world with this classic ketogenic diet and other forms of the ketogenic diet. They usually will recommend to patients to give it at least 3 months to see if it makes a difference in how many seizures they have.
Mhm.
So I kind of think the same thing applies here.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. And the ketone salts are much more palatable. You can get them in lots of flavors. Of course, the dosing probably matters as far as, the one that I use is about 17 grams of BHB salts. And my brain, oh, I think my brain's normal, but I definitely use them for that cognitive benefit, good appetite suppression if I'm charting and I'm like, just trying to focus on something, or I love taking them, before I podcast or when I'm trying to have, a meeting that I really need to use my brain. I feel like kind of that light bulb effect, like Steve was talking about, you just feel like your brain's functioning at a higher level. And so I think it's so cool that they're an option now, for people. They are kind of expensive still, but especially if you're using them multiple times per day.
I tend to do something like that twice a day: ketone ester and or ketone salts. There's other products that are coming out that aren't, they're kind of hybrids in
Yeah.
a way. There's one out now that it's a combination of C6, which is the medium chain triglyceride, that has kind of been, it was kind of, not much has been done with it. It's the most ketogenic of the medium chain triglycerides, but it also is the worst tasting of the medium chain triglycerides. So it's kind of a challenge to make a product with it, but there's one out there that's a combination of C6 and a ketone ester that they've made it into like some type of a ketone ester. And it needs work on the taste department. But other things coming along, like a hybrid of ester and salt. There are a couple of those out now, or about to come out.
If somebody was wanting to start MCT oil or coconut oil for, their loved one who has Alzheimer's, what's the best? Obviously, there can be some GI side effects. So what's the best way to start, supplementing with that?
Yeah. Don't start with 7 teaspoons. um, yeah, we were lucky that Steve didn't have like a major mishap, when he took that much. So I usually recommend that, especially with MCT oil, maybe starting with a half to 1 teaspoon, twice, a couple times a day with food. You're more likely to tolerate it if you eat it with food. And then to increase by that amount every 2 or 3 days, maybe. Just kind of go slow. And just see how well you tolerate it. In Cunane studies, they were testing 30 mLs a day. So that's 2 tablespoons a day. They were given 1 tablespoon twice a day of MCT oil. And the one he used was the standard C8, C10 MCT. It's a mixture of medium chain triglycerides. C8 by itself, it's out there as a supplement that you can get, but it's much more likely to cause diarrhea. And then C10 has its own special benefits. C10 is different than C8 because it has anticonvulsant effects, which is really interesting, but it also stimulates mitochondria to multiply, which is kind of a unique thing. And if you have more mitochondria, you can make more ATP. So, mitochondria make like a couple dozen proteins and all kinds of other metabolites too. A lot goes on in those mitochondria. So, it kind of benefits to different, maybe possible combinations of medium chain triglycerides. And then there's another one out there that is about 1/3 lauric acid. And lauric acid is C12. It is half of the fat in coconut oil. And I think it could be the big reason why my husband improved so much. There's a study that was done in Japan, and they looked at each of the medium chain triglycerides, C8, C10, C12, and then C18, which is a long chain fatty acid that's very prevalent in foods. And they found that they did, like with cultures of astrocytes, that they found that lauric acid potently stimulates ketone production in astrocytes. So it could be that the effect isn't related to what the blood levels are, but that lauric acid, may find its way into the brain and stimulate ketone production directly in astrocytes, which nourish neurons. So that could be one of the mechanisms that, explain why my husband improved so much just with coconut oil.
Right.
So I like there's one, it's on the market. They're using it in a study in Australia for Alzheimer's, and it's here in the US, the only brand I know of that is like this is Carrington Farms liquid coconut cooking oil. It's almost 1/3 lauric acid, and then has C8 and C10. And it's a nice cooking oil. It's just a creamy yellow, and it's maybe $14 for a whole quart of it. So it's a good, inexpensive way to, do a little ketogenic thing there.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Newport, this has been so wonderful. And we're going to have to record part 2 and talk about newborn physiology, because I want to pick your, no, that's okay. Because I think this was good just to talk about Alzheimer's and all the benefits, but tell people where they can find you and where they can find your new book when it's coming out.
So I have a website. It's called Coconut Ketones with an S.com. Ketones is Ketones, no Y in it. And I have a page for Alzheimer's and dementia. And then I have another page. It's more towards diabetes and weight loss, with a low carb, higher fat diet, that type of thing. My previous book was called The Complete Book of Ketones, a practical guide to ketogenic diets and ketone supplements. So my new book is called Clearly Keto for Healthy Brain Aging and Alzheimer's Prevention. And, basically the ketogenic diet as a foundation for improving insulin resistance, providing ketones to the brain, but then It's got probably half the book is about other lifestyle changes, increasing physical activity, controlling blood pressure, diagnosing and treating sleep apnea, getting adequate sleep. I mean, there are a lot of lifestyle risk factors that have been identified that, if changed, could potentially reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's or dementia. And now at the Alzheimer's Association meetings, which I listen to every year, they say about 30% of dementias could be prevented through changing these modifiable lifestyle risk factors. So the book is a lot about that, and then certain things to avoid too, like we mentioned, processed, overly processed foods, processed meats and foods and that type of thing. So
wonderful. I can't wait to get my hands on it and take a look at it.
Coming out in 2022, probably in the fall. So it's got a ways to go with editing and everything.
Yeah, what a labor of love. I know I've heard it's a process with book writing. I've been dabbling with writing one of my own. So you guys, Dr. Mary Newport, coconutketones.com. You can find access to her books and her information. She's such a wealth of knowledge, and you're going to touch so many people by continuing to, share Steve's story. So thank you for being so open about that. I'm going to have you back because we'll do a pregnancy, newborn physiology episode. We'll talk about newborn nutrition because that's super fascinating, I know, to a lot of my listeners. So I end all of my podcasts with the semen analysis because I'm Dr. Semen. So on the semen analysis today, you guys, if you know somebody suffering with Alzheimer's, it's growing. The numbers are growing. It's more common in women than in men. So it's something that I encounter in my practice. Go look at the therapeutic applications of the ketogenic diet, MCT oil, coconut oil, exogenous ketone use for these people, because as Dr. Newport, has highlighted today, it can improve the quality of life. We still don't have anything that can improve necessarily, curing it or preventing death from it. But if we can improve the time that our loved ones have here on this earth, then that's what we're all here for. So, Dr. Newport, thank you so much. And I appreciate your time, and we're going to chat again soon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seaman.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening to the Fit and Fabulous podcast. Make sure you share this with all your friends. Download, leave your reviews on Apple Podcasts. We appreciate you. Have a great day.